First, some more logistics. Ladies and gentlemen, do you have iClickers? Let's see how many people have iClickers. Let's start clicking away. A for yes, B for no, C for maybe. We were at 44 iClickers last time. There are 155 seats in the auditorium, but I don't think the class will stay at that. They'll stay all that large. Given that we appear to be at 125, 130 right now, 85 out of 130 is not bad. Okay, maybe, all right. The maybes are definitely cautious. I won't claim that there's a right answer on this one since I'm amused. But a little sounding of where people are. Are you currently enrolled in this class, or are you on the wait list? And if you're on the wait list or if you are enrolled, are you going to drop either your spot on the class or your spot on the wait list? I'd like to know, if only so I can figure out exactly how worried we should be about the absence of spots, in this particular class. And 10, 9, 8, 7. Of course, people on the wait list are probably not people who have bought iClickers yet unless they need them for another course. So this isn't the best of all possible questions. Oh, wow. Nobody wants to drop. That's interesting. Everyone here is going to show up again next Tuesday. That's good. All right, that's not quite. I was hoping to say there'd be a couple of drops, and so we wouldn't have any problems at all, because as of 9 a.m. this morning, the course plus wait list was at 163 people, and we have 155 slots. But given that I think we now have only 140 people here, it's plain that unless a bunch of people who are not here want to take this course and are higher on you than the wait list, then I can be confident. In fact, I can be highly confident that everyone here in this room who wants to get in will. Of course, something could still go wrong. Something always goes wrong. As former Defense Secretary Donald Rumsfeld says, there are the things you know, and the things you know that you don't know. Where you get into real trouble are the things you know but you don't know that you know them, and the things that you don't know where you don't know that you don't know them. There's always that around, and I can't imagine what it would be. But barring that happening, everyone here should be in off the wait list, registered in the course by early next week. Problem set 1, we have our problem set 1 now up at the now up on the website for the course. It's due on Thursday, January 27th at the start of lecture. It's a combination scavenger hunt through internet data and listen to lecture problem set. Other problem sets will involve model building and computation. This one doesn't. This one is a warm-up. Read the assigned chapters in the textbook, look at the inside covers of the textbook, listen to lectures, browse around the Federal Reserve Economic Data website, looking for keywords like hires and fires and job openings and labor turnover, and also browse the very interesting Gapminder World website, which has a bunch of absolutely marvelous statistics with respect to global development over the past 2 centuries. Do all that, and you should be absolutely fine with problem set 1. Problem set 1 has 20 questions. This is what they look like. They're, I think, at least relatively easy, to solve. A few more logistical questions as I try to figure out who you are and what you know. The first question is, when and where did you all take Econ 1? You all are supposed to have taken Econ 1 or at least placed out of Econ 1 by having a high AP test score in the past. I'd like to know where and when, so I can have a sense of what your Econ 1 experience was like, because different Econ 1 courses can be quite different in terms of what you learn, what they teach you. And what do we get? Before last semester here at Berkeley, in high school as an AP course, very few, 20% at some other university. That's interesting. I'd expect that to be 10% given our transfer student. And of course, let me apologize to the 4 of you who took Econ 1 from me here last semester and who learned nothing at all during it. I'll try to do better the next time I teach it. Okay, but that's helpful. And also, what are your politics, if I may ask? Anonymously, that is. There are no right answers for this. I ask because, as German sociologist of a century ago, Max Weber, said in a famous speech he gave on education and scholarship as a vocation, the most important task for any teacher is to take the students that he or she has and to make sure that they see and register those facts that are inconvenient for their particular political point of view. Good. A bunch of Republicans. I can be fairly nonpartisan and balanced here. Okay. Yes. Okay, we'll do a recount. We'll see if the machine is behaving better this time. Oh dear, this may have to switch. They may be asking an iClicker question in the calculus class next door, which is enormous. We'll see. We'll resolve this. We may have to switch our channel. It's nice that I can be nonpartisan rather than spending all my time pointing out to the Democrats like me the unpleasant things about the world that don't correspond to their vision of it, but instead can be relatively balanced. I will try to do so. And last question, recall from last lecture, about how much bigger is total world GDP. That is, income per capita times the number of people that we have in the world than it was back 10,000 years ago. What do you think the answer is? And the answer you give doesn't have to give the answer that I gave in the last lecture. This isn't really a right answer type of question here, when there are right answer type of questions. I will tell you what they are. Okay, we're evenly spread out among A, B, and C, with a bunch of people saying D, and very few people saying E. And I would actually take either of B, D, and E as a good answer. As for E, let's take the least popular one. That you can't really make comparisons of standards of living across such an enormous span as, say, the year 0 and today, because everyone's tastes and preferences are different. Everyone is different. We today are very different people than our ancestors were back 2,500 years ago. Activities that we like to do, like playing Halo, say, or watching Grey's Anatomy, are things that they would find absolutely bizarre and uninteresting and unimportant. By contrast, things that they did, worshiping, say, the god Jupiter, the things that they got enormous amounts of satisfaction from, we think of as particularly silly and strange. You can make that point. I think it's probably wrong. I think there's a good deal more of what humans like and of human commonality than that. Right? We all want enough food not to be hungry, enough clothing not to be cold, enough shelter not to be wet. We want to find people to love and to love us during our lifetime, and we want to be amused. Do all those things, and we tend to be pretty happy. Economies are ways of trying to assemble the resources to do these things, and we can, I think, fairly well classify whether an economy is doing well or badly. D, as I say, D, that such comparisons are very hard to make. That back when my great-grandfather was teaching at Washington University in St. Louis, he got to go to Cambridge, Massachusetts once and only once a year. And then his brother would get him into the big Widener library there with its 6 million volumes. And he could do real research because Widener had 10 times the library of Washington University in St. Louis, and he could do a whole bunch more of his work there and read lots of things he could never see otherwise. It was a really big deal. It involved a 3-day train trip there and back. Something that took immense amounts of resources and was terribly valuable to him. By contrast, for me here today, there may be one thing in 25 I want to look at that's in Widener Library and a couple other places and no place else and not here at Berkeley, but I can get it through interlibrary loan in a week and a half, and I do. And as for a 2 or 3 day train trip across the country no, we simply fly there in 5 hours. And I always fly there overnight because it seems a waste of time to fly all day and then not sleep the following night. If I'm not going to sleep well when I get to the East Coast because of jet lag, I might as well not sleep well on the plane. And it's something that was a very big deal then, not a big deal to me at all. It's unclear how to measure the changes in our life capacities and in our life statuses, given that we have access to a lot of powers and capabilities that they did not. You tell someone 2,000 years ago that even working class people would be able to afford to fly across 3,000 miles a couple times a year in 5 hours, and they would say, wow, that society must be so extraordinarily rich, everyone must be ecstatically happy all the time. And yet we're not. We're not ecstatically happy. We might be pretty happy. We're not ecstatically so. There's an argument within economics as to whether rich countries are happier or are much happier than poor ones are. So I think D's an argument you can make. For the others, I think there's definitely a right answer. That is, we think that about 10,000 years ago, there were somewhere between 5 and 10 million people in the world. That's about all that the world can support with humans pursuing a hunter-gatherer lifestyle. Right? Gathering edible plants is a fairly labor-intensive process. Hunting large animals is a dangerous process. Hunting small animals is an annoying process. We don't see the ability of us with stone tools being able to support more than 5 or 10 million people on the planet until we actually start planting our own plants where we want them to be and then guarding them from the squirrels and the birds, and until we actually take the cow and the sheep and the goat and we domesticate them so that they come to us when we call. Do that and you can support marvelous human populations. And indeed, we now have almost 7 million people rather than 5 million. 7 billion people rather than 5 million. That itself is a multiple of 1,000 in total world GDP. Add to it the fact that we think that we're 15 times richer, at least in a GDP production sense, than our predecessors were 10,000 years ago. That gets you to the 17,000 times number. About 14 times bigger is a good answer to the question of how much richer are we as individuals than our predecessors were 10,000 years ago, looking across the planet as a whole. About 1,200 times bigger is probably the answer to how much bigger is the human population than it was 10,000 years ago. But you multiply them together, you get total economic production. You really want the number of 17,000 to keep in your head. That's what you should say. So there, I've already burned up half an hour on logistics and throat clearing. That's not great with respect to my finishing the whole syllabus I've planned out by the early April so that then we can do additional topics. We'll see how it goes. Measuring the macroeconomy. We want to have a whole bunch of measures of how the economy as a whole is doing. What are they? How do we construct them? And once again, I'd like to know how much you know. How much national income accounting did you do in your Econ 1 class? When Christy Romer, for example, teaches Econ 1 here at Berkeley, she skips national income accounting entirely because it's boring. When Marty only teaches it, she spends a bunch of time on national income accounting because she thinks it's important. And if you kind of don't really know what you're measuring, you don't have any chance of understanding what the numbers mean when they announce on the television that GDP is 14.2 trillion, or whatever they say. And once again, let's try that again. I think we may have to talk to the math class. Well, that's considerably better. All right, so even if a bunch of these are coming in from the math class next door, we still have a large plurality about how we barely did any. Okay, that's expected. That means I should actually spend some time talking about what the aggregate numbers in the economy that are worth paying a lot of attention to now. Right now, I happen to think that there are 6 kind of aggregate numbers on the economy that are worth paying a lot of attention to. The first is GDP, real GDP, gross domestic product adjusted for inflation, and also its dependent statistics, gross domestic product per worker and gross domestic product per capita. GDP divided by the population, GDP per capita, kind of tells us how rich a society is in terms of how much is the value of goods and services that are being produced. GDP per worker tells us how productive the average worker is. And GDP total tells us what the total value of marketed final goods and services produced in the country is in some particular time, usually a year. GDP is almost always measured as so-and-so dollars of such and such purchasing power each year. So the first statistic is GDP. The second is the unemployment rate. The unemployment rate is useful mostly as a measure of slack and waste and bad performance in the economy. When the unemployment rate is higher than its kind of normal good times level of 5% or so, it's a sign that something's going wrong and that a lot of stuff that could be being produced and sold in the country isn't, because something's gone wrong with the economic mechanism. There's also inflation and the price level. Inflation being the rate of change of the overall price level, the price level being some kind of average of the dollar prices at which goods and services are being sold in the country. Inflation is interesting because it's a measure of how well the economy is enabling rational calculation. If an economy is undergoing high or even moderate inflation, then people don't really understand what prices mean in terms of scarcities. They don't know what to compare prices to. And so it's hard to make rational decisions about either production or consumption. If someone quotes you a price of $15 for a particular good and you don't really know what that means because prices have been changing, drifting upward almost always, for some substantial period of time at some substantial rate. Then there are three financial market measures that are worth looking at. The first is the stock market, largely because it's a measure of business confidence. You want to know whether businesses and investors have confidence in the future. Look at what the stock market is doing. Second are interest rates on short-term government bonds. They're a measure of the scarcity or the ampleness of liquidity in the economy, of whether there's enough purchasing power, enough liquid cash in the hands of individuals for people to easily buy what they think they want to buy, and thus for people to sell what they want to sell. An economy in which short-term government bond interest rates are very high is likely to be an economy that's very short of liquid cash, and so a whole bunch of transactions that people would like to make, they can't. They're short of cash, and so something's likely to be going wrong. Third are long-term interest rates, real interest rates on long-term corporate bonds, and that's a measure of business access to capital. Can businesses that think they have productive opportunities to expand and make more actually find the financing allowing them to build more factories and install more machine tools? Those are the 6 sets of economic statistics that you should pay most attention to in macro. And now we're going to talk about GDP. GDP as a concept was designed by one of my teachers, Simon Kuznets, an economist, American economist back in the 1930s. He noted that nobody really had a very good idea of how large and productive the economy was. And so he began to think about what statistic can I easily estimate pretty much all by myself with the data that we have available. And he came up with gross domestic product. He said what we want to know is how much useful stuff is being produced in the economy and how many useful services are being provided by people in the economy. And we're going to divide those services into 4 categories, each of which we can measure pretty well. The first is consumption spending by households. What kinds of things, of goods and services, are households buying for their own use? Whether it's a washing machine or a standing rib roast or some, a dish of tofu surprise or whatever, a yoga lesson, what are households buying that they think is useful for themselves? The second is what are businesses doing to expand their productive capacity? What are businesses doing to increase the amount of goods that they are be able to produce in the future? And we want to add investment spending to consumption spending. We don't just want to measure consumption spending because we'd say a society in which consumption spending is low but investment is high because people are taking a lot of care for the future and want to become richer in the future. We wouldn't say that that economy is poorer than one that had higher consumption and no savings and investment. Then, in addition, there's a government. And the government does lots of very useful things that make our lives easier. Certainly, right now, the government is rebuilding the Bay Bridge between here and San Francisco because the eastern span of the old Bay Bridge was sufficiently damaged by the Loma Prieta earthquake that there's a good chance that if there's another similar earthquake, it will fall down. And we'd rather not have that happen than be cut off from San Francisco except through via BART and the Trans-Bay Tube, which is also vulnerable to the next earthquake. We'd rather have a bridge so that we can get to San Francisco and back. Now, we could survive without such a bridge. When my grandfather lived in San Francisco in the early 1920s for one summer, when he was in college, He was an intern at an investment bank down in the financial district. He said he lived down by the Berkeley Marina and took the ferry across and back every day, and it was absolutely wonderful. You'd cruise about on the bay in your ferry, you'd watch the birds, you'd watch the sea lions. Either way, you'd arrive feeling refreshed and in touch with the great natural beauty of the San Francisco Bay Area, as opposed to the rather draggy experience of driving across a bridge and getting stuck for 15 minutes breathing gasoline fumes when the traffic backs up as you come down the span of the suspension bridge part. Nevertheless, we think the Bay Bridge is useful. The government is purchasing it for us. If we don't include government purchases in GDP, we don't get that amount of economic activity in our measure at all. Last is net exports. We're interested in how much we produce, that we're interested in how productive the economy is. And they can have a case in which an economy is running a large trade surplus, in which it's producing more than it's consuming, and as a result it's exporting an awful lot of goods and services, and so piling up assets abroad as foreigners owe us money back. We want to say that that economy is highly productive and prosperous. By contrast, an economy like the U.S. today that is consuming more than it's producing, that's importing a lot of stuff and not exporting as much, and that is running itself into debt to foreigners and to people in foreign countries, for that economy, it's actually less productive and prosperous than simply adding up consumption spending, investment spending, and government purchases would tell us. So we want to add net exports, if exports are greater than imports, or subtract net imports when imports are greater than exports, as they are now in the United States, in order to get our total measure of GDP. And notice in all of this, we count final goods, right, not intermediate goods. We're not terribly interested if a business buys something from another business and then the business uses what it bought in order to make something that it then sells to consumers. Because a business isn't a person with a mind. A business is just a nexus of contracts. That a business has managed to buy something, well, that's nice, but that doesn't affect any sense of our final utility or how rich we are. What we want to know is we want to know what final demanders are buying. And that's consumers on the one hand, the government to the extent that it buys things that are useful to us on the other, net exports on the third, and then businesses to the extent that they are buying to expand their capacity, not the extent that they are simply buying in order to conduct their normal operations. That's what it is, gross domestic product, the total value of final goods produced in the United States, divided into four categories: consumption, investment, government purchases, and net exports. Simon Kuznets and company built up this concept in the 1930s, and it's been a very useful one. It's relatively easy to calculate. Unfortunately, it's not a very good one. The GDP is not a terribly good measure of economic welfare. And so I've given you 5 choices as to why it isn't a very good measure of economic welfare. The first is that it doesn't incorporate envy and spite, relative income effects. That to the extent that, say, people like me would buy an iPad on the first day that it was sold, in part because other people would then be envious of me, that really isn't a contribution to economic welfare, right? I feel happy, they feel unhappy. That's not in GDP. That GDP measures market price rather than willingness to pay. That GDP does not account for resource depletion. That it does not account for externalities, or even that it counts dollars rather than utilities. That if, for example, you have 2 million people, as you had in India in 1942, who have no incomes, because the export industries of India have been disrupted by the presence of an imperial Japanese carrier fleet in the Bay of Bengal, and so they have no jobs, and so they have no money, and so if 2 million people starve to death in the Bengal famine, that doesn't affect Indian GDP in 1942. But a measure that doesn't take account of the fact that 2 million people starve to death because they have no income, that's certainly something that should be any good measure in economic welfare. And it looks like we have a lot of students of Amartya Sen in this particular, right? And that's certainly a very true reason why you shouldn't take GDP too seriously as a measure of economic welfare. But it also doesn't account for externalities. It doesn't account for resource depletion. It measures market price, right, rather than willingness to pay, and that's not terribly good. For example, back in 1985, when I was a graduate student, Encyclopedia Britannica asked my teacher, Larry Summers, if he'd write an article for them, and he said yes, he would, but he'd write it only if he could have a co-author write it with him, that is me, and only if Encyclopedia Britannica gave me a free copy of the Encyclopedia Britannica so I could study it to find out what Encyclopedia Britannica articles were like. And they did so, and I've been very grateful to Larry since, and that was a $2,000 present from Encyclopedia Britannica to me. As I say, this thing costs $500, and among other things, it has free access to Wikipedia, which is for practically everything I would like to know, actually a better resource than Encyclopedia Britannica, perhaps because they copied the 1911 Encyclopedia Britannica and used it as the basis for Wikipedia, perhaps because a lot more people work on it than work on Encyclopedia Britannica, because Jimmy Wales, Wikipedia's founder, is a kind of charismatic hypnotist. The fact that when I buy this, it only counts as $500 of value added, as opposed to, well, this has use X, it replaces an encyclopedia, which would cost me $2,000. It largely replaces a television, which would cost me $400. It replaces me 8 trips to Widener Library at Harvard over the course of a given year. Add all those up, and you could easily say that something like this would produce as much utility to me as $10,000 worth of expenditures that I would have made back in 1985. Back in 1985, when I was a little bit more than your age. That's a huge addition to at least my economic welfare that's not captured in GDP accounts. So measuring market price rather than willingness to pay, and also it doesn't incorporate spite or envy effects either. So all 5 of these answers are correct. It's not a very good measure, but it's an easy to calculate one. It's one we all use. And because we all use it, we're not going to move off of it anytime soon. Perhaps we should. The components of GDP. As I said, there's consumption spending by households of currently produced goods and services. Valued at market prices, there's only one big exception to consumption spending being what people actually buy. And that's imputed rent on owner-occupied housing. That is, because about half of Americans rent and half of Americans live in houses that they own, in order to try to put things on a level playing field, the people constructing the GDP accounts take a look at all the people who own their own homes, and they say, about how much would they be paying in rent if they were renting these homes rather than owning them? That's a useful service produced by the economy, the ability to live in a house. It's not fair to count half of that in GDP and not count the other half. We'll count all of it by saying that people who live in houses that they own should be thought of as, in some sense, paying themselves rent. Investment spending by businesses seeking to expand their productive capacity by adding to their capital stock or needing capital to replace or repair worn-out or obsolete capital. Ideally, when you tried to measure the size of the economy, you'd say, wait a minute, you just want to measure that part of investment spending that's firms expanding. You don't want to measure that part of investment spending which is firms replacing stuff that's gotten worn out or obsolete. That's just a normal cost of business. That's not actually provision for the future. That's just keeping things as we are. We would like to be able to count net investment by businesses rather than gross investment. And so we'd like to be able to calculate net domestic product rather than gross domestic product. The Commerce Department's Bureau of Economic Analysis does so, but it doesn't like its net domestic product numbers because it doesn't trust its ability to distinguish investments by businesses that expand from investments by businesses that simply repair things that are wearing out. As a result, we talk almost all the time about GDP, even though we think it's in some sense the wrong statistic, because we have a firmer estimate, a better estimate of it, than of the better statistic, net domestic product. What's also the case is when you think about what a firm owns that's productive, it's not just the machines and the buildings it owns. It's also all the goods that it's making and all the goods that it's made and it hasn't sold yet, that those are productive assets as well. Hence, inventories are a part of the capital stock, which means that increases in inventories are a part of investment spending and are counted in GDP, and that causes significant problems. That is, when the textile firms in Los Angeles make and Macy's buys a huge amount of pants, that people say, God, those are really ugly, we're not going to buy them. They sit in Macy's as an addition to inventory. When Macy's constructs its inventory at the end of the year, it says, we have all these pants. We've greatly added to the stock of goods we have in the store. Our inventory has gone way, way up. But that's not actually something that's productive, because those pants are then going to be sent off to TJ Maxx and sold at a highly discounted value to people who wear them 3 or 4 times and then hide them in the back of the closet out of shame or whatever. The fact that investments, that when firms make mistakes and produce the wrong stuff, this shows up in the GDP accounts as an increase in inventories, and thus counts in GDP is another problem with the statistic. Government purchases, things the government buys to make citizens happier. It's in there because we don't want GDP to change if the government role expands or contracts, but if consumers are still receiving the same goods and services. We don't want changes in the government's role to cause big changes in measured GDP. The problem with valuing the government is we can't measure what the government produces very well because it doesn't sell it. That even the tolls on the Bay Bridge cover only a small part of its cost. We can, however, measure pretty much what government buys, which means that government purchases are a good place to try to measure the contribution to GDP. And last, there's net exports, because we want a measure of production more than we want a measure of spending. And you have to add net exports or subtract net imports to consumption, investment, and government purchases in order to get a version of production. I said before why we don't count intermediate goods, because businesses aren't brains and aren't happy when they buy things. We count only final goods. I said that GDP minus capital depreciation equals net domestic product. There are also a couple of other measures that you'll sometimes see. That gross domestic product is a measure of the value of all the stuff produced by people and capital located in the United States. There are bunches of U.S. citizens and permanent residents abroad. There are a bunch of citizens and residents of other countries here. There is a bunch of property in one country that's owned by citizens of another. There's an alternative statistic, gross national product, which is the value of everything produced by the citizens of the United States, whether it's produced here or in Thailand or whatever. We focus on GDP largely because we're not too confident of our ability to estimate GNP, because keeping track of property flowing across countries and peoples is rather difficult. We also sometimes look at final sales of domestic product, as a way of getting away from the inventory problem, from the counting as productive things, rises in inventories that aren't really there. So we look not at what's made, but at what's sold. And we also look at total final sales, how much people in America are spending, which is final sales of domestic product plus net imports, and it tells us how much we're spending rather than just how much we're spending on domestically made goods. We can estimate GDP at a couple of different points. The way we estimate it is we look at what businesses make and what people buy. That's GDP. By arithmetic, GDP should be equal to GDI. Gross domestic product should be equal to gross domestic income, which is what businesses pay out in wages, salaries, fringes, rent, and profits. That after all, what people buy is the amount of money that flows into businesses, and the business then sends that money out, either to wages and salaries and fringes to its workers, in rent to owners of land and natural resources, in profit to owners of capital. The business isn't itself a thing that earns money. It spends it out and gives it to somebody else, that every dollar that flows into a business should then flow out to somebody else as a dollar of income. And if we try to measure gross domestic product and gross domestic income, we should get the same numbers. Actually, we don't. Right now, gross domestic income is running behind gross domestic product by 2 or 3% or so. Sometimes it runs ahead of, sometimes it runs behind it. The difference between GDP and GDI has the nice name of the statistical discrepancy. Right? Something's gone wrong with our estimation system somewhere. We're not entirely sure where. It's something to worry about. So, back to your iClickers. What's our basic adding up equation for the components of GDP? What's the most important thing to keep in mind when you try to figure out what GDP is in terms of what different flows of spending do we take together and add up in order to produce it? And we're at 82. Right, Y equals C plus I plus G plus net exports. That's 68%. That's pretty good. That's what we're looking for. We want the plus in net exports rather than the minus. The idea is we want a measure of production, so we have to take the amount of spending in the United States, C plus I plus G, and then add to that the difference between spending and production. And if we're exporting more than we're importing, if net exports are positive, that means we're producing more than we're spending, and we want to add that to GDP. Subtracting net exports would produce a measure that isn't coherent at all. It would mean the more we produced and the more we exported, the lower GDP would be. We very much want the plus net exports there. What is GDP? Well, let's go back to the peak of the last business cycle, to the third quarter of 2007, when someone appeared on the news one morning and reported that the Commerce Department's Bureau of Economic Analysis reported that third quarter GDP had been $14.1799 trillion at an annual rate. What does that mean? It doesn't mean that we produced $14 trillion and change of stuff in the third quarter of 2007, because the GDP number was reported at an annual rate, that is, in dollars per year. What it means is the pace of production in the third quarter of 2007, in July, August, and September of 2007, was such that if we'd kept producing at that rate for an entire year, we'd have produced 14.1799, etc., trillion dollars. Actually, we produced only a quarter of that in the third quarter. But it's conventional to report GDP statistics as annual rates because the general idea is it's an ongoing flow. It's very much like a velocity. It's not a stock of goods. Instead, it's a flow of production. that we're producing 14.18 trillion this year and next year and the year after and so forth. It's a measure of economic activity. It's not a stock of wealth. Of this 31 billion at an annual rate was a change in inventories. Now, that doesn't mean that businesses' inventories at the end of September were 31 billion higher than they'd been at the end of June. It's an annual rate. Right? They were saying that inventories were building up at such a pace that if things continued for a year, there'd be 31 billion more of inventories. Instead, there was a little bit more than 8 billion more of inventories at the end of September than there'd been at the end of June. But once you take account of the fact that you're measuring things at an annual rate, you get up to 31 billion. That at the time was worrisome, right? Because that 31 billion rate of inventory accumulation was unexpected. That meant that businesses had been making things in July, August, and September and hadn't been finding quite as many customers as they'd expected, which meant that they were likely to start firing more people in October, November, and December than we had previously thought, and thus that the economy's downturn might turn out to be bigger than people had thought back at the end of June when we were thinking there would only be a very small recession. Subtract off the 31 billion change in inventories, and you get 14.148.8 trillion as the final sales of domestic product in the third quarter of 2007. Now, that final sales of domestic product was a lot less than the amount of stuff that people in the United States bought in the third quarter of 2007. In the third quarter of 2007, people actually bought $14.85 trillion worth of stuff. Where does this difference come from? Well, this difference is net exports, our net exports of minus $700 billion or so. The fact that we were importing $700 billion more of stuff than that we were exporting. That all the container ships that arrive at Long Beach and at Oakland arrive with the containers full, and half of the containers that go back empty, or stuffed with things like old newspapers that are extremely low value for weight. But if the container is going back empty, well, you might as well put something in it that someone would be willing to pay for on the other side of the Pacific. That difference between the $1.685 trillion of exports at an annual rate in the third quarter of 2007 and the $2.384 trillion of imports as an annual rate of 2007 measures how unbalanced the United States' trade was back then and still is. So those are the very basic GDP numbers. And the way to conceptualize it is that we do indeed have a circular flow of economic activity going on there. That is, that households spend money buying the products made by businesses, and businesses then turn around and spend the money paying the factors of production owned by households. That after all, businesses need to buy workers' time and attention, need to buy finance, need to buy the use of land and other property from households because households own this stuff. And so first, households use their cash and their credit to buy stuff from businesses, and then businesses use the money that they've earned to pay for the factors of production, the stuff they need from households. And by this time, the cash and credit has gotten back to households, and they can do the same thing again. That they can then go and in the next 3 months buy a whole bunch more stuff from businesses for the next 3 months, which then use the same cash and liquidity to pay households once again for labor, for capital, for natural resources, for innovative knowledge, for entrepreneurship, for all kinds of things. And so the economy works as a system in spite of the fact that you have 140 million workers employed out there, each of whom is making only a very small part of what he or she consumes. That back at the start of the 1800s, when for the first time you had the world shifting, say, from an economy in which still 3/4 of everybody were peasants, and peasants pretty much grow their own food. They sell some, but mostly they grow their own food, and mostly they make their own stuff. That back in a world in which something like 2/3 of all useful stuff, goods and services, are performed inside the household and only 1/3 are sold on markets, there was a great deal of worry about what might happen if you moved to a more commercial and more market economy. Would things add up? Would things go smoothly? Might it possibly the case that, I don't know what, that the assembled baristas of Berkeley were making cafe lattes, and the assembled artisan potters of Berkeley were making pots, and the assembled yoga instructors of Berkeley wanted to teach yoga, but that because no one would buy the lattes, the baristas would have no money to buy yogas or pots, and so the potters would have no money to buy yoga lessons, and so the yoga instructors would have no money to buy coffee, and so the whole system would grind to a halt. And the answer is slightly. That's what's happening now with our unemployment rate of 9.4% rather than its normal 5%. But still, the unemployment rate is only 9.4%. It's not 100%. It's never gotten to 100%. The highest the unemployment rate got in the U.S. was 23% in 1933. 95% is pretty good. 90.6% employment rate, that's not great. Actually, that's terrible, but it's right that 90.6% of workers in America employed is much better than zero. That the circular flow of economic activity, by and large, works. And when you track the circular flow, you really need to keep track of 5 different things that happen aside from the overall flow back of incomes from businesses to households as they buy the labor time and the capital and the brains of households to produce. You need to keep track of the flow of consumption spending. You need to keep track of the flow of taxes from households to governments. And we used to run a government surplus, now we don't. Now this arrow should go the other way. And we have a flow of money from financial institutions to governments as the government borrows money. And the flow of net taxes and of the government deficit is together what the government gets that it then uses to pay for its purchases. You also have the savings of households, which flow into financial markets, and some of them are then diverted to government as the government borrows. The rest of it is then borrowed by businesses, which uses them to finance their investment spending to expand their capacity. And over on the far right, we have this diversion of the flow of spending from domestically produced goods to foreign goods, that is net imports. And indeed, when you have a large amount of net imports, the $700 billion a year we were having back in 2007, well, what does that mean? That means that U.S. consumers and businesses have paid foreigners $700 billion extra dollars that the foreigners have not then used to turn around and buy products from the United States. What, if you're living in China or Saudi Arabia or Germany, do you do if someone has just paid you $700 billion? You can't use dollar bills to buy stuff in China or Saudi Arabia or Germany. Well, actually, you can, but those are usually suitcases full of $100 bills, which are used in illegal transactions. But unless you're going to become part of organized crime, global organized crime, which most people aren't, what do you do if you've sold something to an American consumer, but there's nothing that America is producing and exporting that you want to buy? Well, you take your money and you go to a U.S. commercial and investment bank, and you say, here, I have these $700 billion, invest them for me. And so the last part of the circular flow of economic activity is this flow back by which foreigners are investing in the United States and are contributing money that then enters the banking system and then is borrowed or invested in businesses and used to fund businesses' expansion of capacity. you can look at this trade deficit two ways. On the one hand, you can say that U.S. consumers are buying stuff from foreigners and costing us jobs. On the other hand, you can say that foreigners are investing in America and making us more productive. Both ways are about equally true. One more comment about the circular flow, and about the question back at the start of 1800 as to whether this whole economic system would hold together or whether we'd kind of collapse into general chaos, right, in which everyone makes their pots or makes their lattes or tries to teach their yoga lessons and they have no customers because no one has income. And the next thing you know, you're involuntarily starring in a remake of Mad Max Beyond Thunderdome as society collapses. Which, it sometimes does. It came very close to collapsing during the Zimbabwean hyperinflation of the past decade, in large part because the fact that the government couldn't tax and wanted to spend and was printing up huge amounts of money meant that the division of labor close to fell apart. Well, one of the very first economists is this French guy named Jean-Baptiste Say, who I feel a certain affinity to because I was a reasonably senior official, a deputy assistant secretary of the U.S. Treasury in 1993 and 1994. And Jean-Baptiste Say, back in 1791 and 1792, he also was kind of a young man on the make. And he also got a fairly senior job at the French Treasury, that of special assistant to the Secretary of the Treasury, Etienne Clavier, and was looking forward to a nice kind of government career. But it's the French Revolution. And so his patron, the Secretary of the Treasury, is fired, purged, arrested, convicted, tortured, imprisoned, and then the night before he was to be executed by the guillotine, he kills himself, so as not to give his revolutionary adversaries in the more left-wing Mountain Party, headed by Robespierre and Saint-Just, the satisfaction of killing him. He said, I'm going to kill myself, thinking there was value to that. Somehow, Jean-Baptiste Say manages to escape the purging of his patron, not just with his life and his liberty, but with his property as well. And so he moves out to the countryside. He says, I'm going to be a landowner, a gentleman farmer, and a freelance intellectual writing books, as opposed to being a treasury bureaucrat. Being a treasury bureaucrat is simply too risky. And in 1803, Jean-Baptiste Say publishes his Principles of Political Economy, at a time when all of Europe is consumed in an uproar about the Napoleonic Wars. He's going to sit back in his country home and simply write books about economics. And given the likely life expectancy of French Treasury officials, I kind of understand the choice. And Say confronted this very question. Can we be certain that the circular flow of economic activity will add up? And Say said yes. Say said, after all, that nobody's going to make anything unless they plan to use it themselves or to sell it, and that nobody is going to plan to sell nobody's going to sell anything unless they plan to use the money from selling it in order to buy something else. And so that means that everybody's total planned sales of goods and services, including their labor, must be equal to everybody's total planned spending. So the idea that there could be a shortage of demand in the economy as a whole is simply incoherent. That you could well have a shortage of demand for one commodity. Lattes say, if the assembled people of Berkeley decide that we're much too wired, certainly I know I've had more than enough caffeine by this time of the day, and should drop off, decide they're too wired, and perhaps we should pursue inner peace and go take some yoga lessons instead. So you could have a shortage of demand for lattes, but it would be offset because then I would be planning to spend money on yoga lessons, and I'd be out there looking for a yoga instructor. And so Say said, while we certainly can have sectoral unemployment, we could have armies of unemployed baristas down on Shattuck Avenue desperately searching for someplace to hire them, we can't have general unemployment because the absence of demand for one good is associated with an excess of demand for another, because since planned incomes have to be equal to planned spending, if there's less demand for cups of coffee, there's got to be more demand for yoga lessons. And that if the baristas would only move 2 blocks up, they'd find signs in windows of exercise studios saying yoga instructor wanted. So that's what Say said, and that turned out to be wrong. As an economist a generation younger than Jean-Baptiste Say said, the British one, John Stuart Mill, because people don't just buy currently produced goods and services with their incomes. They also buy and sell financial assets, chiefly liquid cash money, but other things as well. And if there's an excess of demand for financial assets, then there very much can be a deficient demand for currently produced goods and services. And after all, if everyone says, I'm not going to buy either a yoga lesson or a latte, I'm instead going to hold on to my cash, and whatever money I earn, I'm going to keep in my wallet because I have only 120 in my wallet and I really want to have 5. Well, then you have an excess demand for cash and deficient demand for both yoga and coffee. And businesses then fire workers. Now, back in Jean-Baptiste Say's scenario, where we had deficient demand for coffee and excess demand for yoga, it was pretty clear what was going to happen. A bunch of people who work as the coffee shops are going to be fired, and then they're going to frantically retrain themselves to take advantage of the high wages and job openings in the yoga instructor market. That's what happens when you have a sectoral shift. But when the excess demand is not for any particular currently produced good or service, but is for liquid cash money instead, well, yeah, it's still the case that the coffee shops fire people, but how can you enter the money-creating business? Maybe you can go down in your basement and start trying to use a fine pen to draw counterfeit copies of $20 bills. But there's no other way to easily enter the money printing business. And so when there's an excess demand for money in the economy as a whole, it can get quite thoroughly wedged, as in fact we are, as we see in our labor market right now, which has gotten quite thoroughly wedged. Now, we do talk about a labor market, but it's a metaphor. It's not like everyone gets together in the town square on Thursday to sell their eggs and their cloth for rice, and prices go up and down, and at the end everyone goes home satisfied having sold everything. Labor market is 150 million workers, 10 million firms, 5 million people getting new jobs each month. A very complicated matching process in which each decision to hire or fire is set at a different negotiated price. It's a very large, decentralized, slow-moving process rather than just a single market where there's a supply curve and a demand curve and everyone knows what the equilibrium price is and everything produced for sale is then bought and sold. Instead, we have unemployment. Here we have the unemployment rate from FRED, the Federal Reserve Economic Data database, at the website research.stlouisfed.org/FRED2, which is one of the places you ought to go to do your first problem set. This is the unemployment rate as calculated by the Bureau of Labor Statistics. The number of people interviewed in the current population survey who said they were looking for work divided by the number of people who said they had jobs plus the number of people who said they were looking for work. And, in normal times, the unemployment rate fluctuates between 4 and 6% or so. And you can talk about structural unemployment there. Bunches of people who really don't have the skills to get the jobs they want, but who keep looking anyway and don't find anything. You can talk about frictional unemployment. Bunches of people who just got fired or who just quit in disgust or who just re-entered the labor force or entered it, who haven't yet found jobs because they're holding out for a better job than the one they could get if they had to get a job today, which would be, working at Safeway as a checking stuff out. And they think they can get a better job than that. But right now our unemployment rate isn't between 4 and 6%. It's kissing 10%. There are lots of people without work who say they would really like jobs like the ones other people with their education and skills have, like the ones they used to have. Why can't they find them? Why do we have an extraordinary inventory of excess workers looking for jobs? We really don't see this in many other markets. We don't see a lot of cases in which there's a huge number of some particular good that everyone agrees is valuable, but that can't really find a market. And there are a couple of theories about how the market really isn't out of whack. Say the Great Vacation theory, that it's simply that Americans decided they'd been working too hard and too long in 2007, and so a bunch of people decided we really don't want a job anymore, but as long as the government will pay me unemployment insurance, if I say I'm looking for a new one, I'll say I'm looking for a new job, even though not really. That's one theory. A great forgetting theory, that we have a whole bunch of workers there who had jobs in 2007, but yet somehow they're really unproductive. They're the real slackers. They're the people who it costs more money to actually get someone to supervise them and make sure they don't break something than they could possibly produce. And that the rise in unemployment from 5 to 10%, is due to the fact we've recognized we have these zero marginal product workers out there, or perhaps firms have forgotten how to manage them. I don't believe that's what's going on at all. Let's do a simple instant recall question. What is the unemployment rate right now? As I said, normally it's between 4 and 6%. What's going on? Right. And there we go. And 9.4%, correct. That's the right answer. I'll also give credit for B, because while the unemployment rate reported on the TV for the month of December is 9.4%, the actual unemployment rate in December is 9.1%. That is, of the people whom the Bureau of Labor Statistics asked in the current population survey who were in the labor force, 9.1% of them said they were unemployed. But December's Christmas. And when Christmas comes around, their unemployment rate is almost always lower than it usually is the rest of the year, because a whole bunch of extra people have been hired to work retail and delivery for all kinds of firms for the Christmas rush. So the Bureau of Labor Statistics thinks that in the month of December, the unemployment rate is 0.3% lower than it is in an average month. And so it seasonally adjusts it by adding 0.3%, and so reports the unemployment rate at 9.4% seasonally adjusted, as opposed to 9.1%, the not seasonally adjusted measure. Right. So I'd take 9.1%. But yeah, it's 9.4%. It's up there. Why am I confident that our high unemployment is the result of a lack of demand in the economy, rather than of something bad going on the supply side, either a loss of work ethic or a loss of human capital or a loss of organizational capital? Well, one way is to look at quits. Right? That if our unemployment were high because a bunch of people had decided they really didn't want to have jobs, you'd have expect to see that the number of people who are quitting their jobs would have gone up between 2007 and today, and it hasn't. It's gone down. It used to be that about 3 million people a month would quit their jobs. You just get fed up with their bosses or be moving someplace else and said either friendly or not friendly, I quit. Then when the recession hit, the number of quits dropped to below 2 million a month and has stayed way down there. That 1/3 of the people who would normally have quit their jobs in an average month haven't been, and haven't been quitting their jobs for 2 years. Why not? Well, because unemployment's high. They know if they quit a job, they're going to have a very hard time getting another one. Your willingness to quit has gone way down precisely because demand is slack and unemployment is high. that behavior of quits is inconsistent with any kind of great vacation theory. Layoffs. Businesses used to fire about 1.8 million people every month. Either fire them because they think they're slackers or lay them off because they're closing down or whatever. Then starting in mid-2008, when the flow of spending on currently produced goods and services dropped off, the number of layoffs and discharges rose to 2.5 million a month, stayed there for 6 to 9 months or so, and since then has slowly come back to normal, that businesses aren't firing people at an elevated rate anymore. Things are no longer getting much worse in the labor market, but it's not the case that layoffs are especially low. And there was this substantial period during which layoffs were very high, and no sign that the people fired were fired because they'd suddenly become worse at doing their jobs. Instead, they were fired because businesses found they had fewer consumers, fewer purchasers in late 2008 and 2009. The obverse of fires is hires. It used to be that in normal times, American businesses would be hiring 5 million people a month. Then, when demand dropped off, they dropped their hiring back to 4 million, and it stayed back at 4 million, except during this little blip in 2010, which is hiring for the census. They're hiring for the census. They hired the census workers. Then the census jobs came to an end. The number of hires went back to normal. It's not the case that businesses are trying to hire more people, and it's definitely not the case that hires are low because although businesses want to hire people, they can't find workers with the skills that they need. Not just the number of hirings has fallen, but the number of job openings that firms post has fallen as well. The net effect of more firings, fewer quits, and fewer hirings is more unemployed people. And an awful lot of the unemployed people have now been unemployed for a long time. Right? More than 6 million people unemployed for more than half a year, people who haven't had a job in at least 6 months, when normally that number of people is between 1 million and 2 million. And back in 2006, you'd have said that the million people who say they're looking for a job but haven't found one in 6 months, they're really not looking that hard. They really don't want a job that much. They just want to say they want a job so their relatives aren't on their back so much. It's much, much harder to say that when the number of long-term unemployed is up at 6 million or so. And let me stop there because we're running out of time, and because I want to be a good citizen in terms of allowing the great flow of people through Berkeley to maintain itself at the appropriate pace. And say we'll see you again next Tuesday when I'll start on economic growth.